What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history pod brought to you by Sideline Sports. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by my fellow host, Sulman Haque. What's up, man? How are you?
Hey, how's it going, dude?
It's going well, man. So on today's episode, we will be talking about the biggest point guard busts of the last 10 years, from 2011 to 2021. We'll be going in order of draft position, so first overall goes first, then second overall, if there was a point guard taken then, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about what went wrong for these guys, how their careers possibly could have been fixed, and a possible ideal team for each of these guys to have been drafted to instead. So without further ado, we'll jump into our list and start with a real doozy. And one guy that, a player that might have been actually ranked number one if we were going to be going in that direction. So we'll start with a player taken first overall in the 2017 draft, and that is Markelle Fultz out of Washington. He was drafted by the 76ers. So what went wrong for him? Honestly, it's kind of a mystery. It's really, really difficult to say what the issue was, but a lot of people have different opinions on what went wrong with him. I read this book. I forget the name of it now, but it was basically a kind of a behind-the-scenes look at the Sam Hinkie era in Philadelphia and the process and all that. And some people said he had a motorcycle accident and he had some kind of nerve damage in his arm where he kind of forgot how to shoot. So if you remember, he couldn't take free throws. He had like a hitch in his free throws. And there was some other folks that just said he had the yips. You know, so we've seen that with some baseball players where guys couldn't throw to first base, like pitchers couldn't throw to first base. There was a catcher on the A's, I believe. I forget his name, but he couldn't throw the ball back to the pitcher after every pitch. So it was very weird. But, you know, the Sixers in general, they kind of have a track record of their early picks getting injured or something going wrong with them. You know, Embiid broke his foot, I think, twice. Ben Simmons broke his foot. And then this kid, Zaire Smith, I believe he had a sesame allergy that they didn't know about, and they almost killed him at the facility. So,
Wow.
yeah, a lot has gone wrong for Markelle Fultz. But, yeah, how could he have been fixed? How could his career have gone in a different direction?
This is a tough one for sure. I mean, the only thing you can really say is maybe not be drafted by the 76ers and not go number one. Because obviously the shoulder thing, nerve damage. Even when he got traded to the Magic, he tore his ACL. And I think he's torn it two different times. He's torn his ACL now with the Magic, or some other pretty long injury that he had after he tore his ACL. So he's been a little injury prone. But I think the Sixers didn't do him any favors. They rushed him back a little bit. They're like the number one pick. They didn't really give him time to recover whatever this injury was, and then probably that developed into him getting some like the yips and things like that. So I think the Sixers just handled the situation very poorly. So I would say maybe he gets drafted somewhere else and he doesn't have to live up to being the number one draft pick, and maybe somewhere like the Suns, right? Where you could pair with someone like Devin Booker, and they bring in CP3, and so there's not as much pressure. And even if he does get this shoulder nerve damage thing going on, he can kind of just sit back and recover from that and really live up to his full potential. But it's really hard to say how would you fix Markelle Fultz, given no one knows what exactly went wrong with him.
Exactly, and that's kind of the mystery. There was just so much weirdness around this draft pick.
A lot of weirdness, especially, I mean, when the Sixers made it, they were like, okay, everyone's like, oh, Fultz, he's going to be great, amazing. And then things started going off the rails with him, like, as soon as he was picked. So it's a weird situation for sure.
And it was a weird time in Philly, too. I believe it was Brian Colangelo was the GM at the time. And shortly, a few years after that, he ended up resigning because he found out he had a burner account that he blamed his wife for having. It was all very strange. And I think one of the things with Fultz is that his mom was like a helicopter tiger mom, and she was super possessive of him and his time and protective of him. And people said that had something to do with the mental issues he had in the game. Going into the draft, I mean, my concern about him was that he didn't take his team to the tournament. It wasn't like he was on, some random small school. He went to Washington, big Pac-12 school. And not even getting to the tournament was kind of a red flag for me. I felt the same about Ben Simmons coming in, which maybe we'll talk about him later. But in general, I thought, if you are a generational player, right, which is what you're hoping for with the first overall pick, maybe you should be good enough to at least get them to the tournament, right?
You would think so.
John Morant did it with John Morant did it with Murray State. All kinds of players from much smaller schools. I'm not saying you have to go and win the whole thing, but to not be one of the best 68 teams in the country is just, it's weird to me. And that was a big turnoff at the time. So yeah, it's unfortunate what happened to him, but it didn't smell right from the beginning. I'll say that.
All right, for sure.
Okay, so next up is a player taken 5th overall in the 2014 draft, and that is Dante Exum, was drafted by the Utah Jazz. So what went wrong for Dante Exum?
Exum was injury, right? Just injuries with him. I think he tore his ACL playing for Australia and for the Australia national team his second year. Then he had a shoulder surgery like the next year. Then he had an ankle injury. Then partially tore his patella tendon, and that was like his 4 years with the Jazz. And then he got traded to the Cavs, and then he's not a great shooter. I think his career field goal percentage is like 40.7, which is not great, especially if you consider he's a point guard. He's probably driving to the basket, things like that. And by 2021 he was out of the league, and he's playing in the EuroLeague right now. And I think he had a lot of potential and a lot of the skill sets people look for, because he was this kind of big, lanky point guard, and people thought he could put it all together. But I think it's hard. It's hard when you have this guy and he's looks super talented, but he's coming out of Australia, and so maybe the lack of competition makes it harder for him to adjust to the NBA. But at the end of the day, it was injuries with him, and he just couldn't ever get healthy enough to live up to that potential.
He still played for, I think, 8 years in the NBA, but never played close to a full season. His career high was his rookie year. He played 82 games, and then he missed the second year with, I believe, that ACL tear that you mentioned. I think the biggest issue with him, as you pointed out, is just injuries. I mean, some people call him the biggest bust in Jazz draft history. I think that's kind of unfair. I think that's probably Enes Kanter, who they thought was going to be a generational Euro big man.
I forgot Kanter went number 3 overall to the Jazz. I was like,
he didn't even. Yeah, you remember I believe he went to Kentucky, and he didn't get to play because of eligibility issues and things like that. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of mystery around him, but maybe he'll come up in our big man bus when we do that pod.
Absolutely. But he probably will be there.
Yeah. The thing is with Exum, man, is he just had so much hype. People were comparing him to Kobe in the pre-draft workouts and things like that. He had the size and the measurables. I mean, he's 6'5", he's versatile, he can play a lot of positions. But injuries are just the one thing that you can't overcome, especially when they kind of compound on each other. And that's usually how it works, right? Some guys, they get one major injury, and maybe it's their biomechanics or something. Everything just goes wrong. Everything goes downhill from there. You tear an ACL, you tear an Achilles, you tear a hamstring, you tear the other ACL. I'm thinking about Boogie Cousins, for example, who just had one injury after another. So I don't know if there is an ideal team for Dante Exum, because even if he's a second-round pick, he's still going to get injured. If he's first overall, he's getting injured. So I don't think there's anything that could have really been done for him. I mean, unless you have another opinion there.
No, I agree with you. There's nothing really he could have done to avoid being injured and things like that. Maybe he just doesn't go play for the Australian national team in 2017, 2015, his second year in the league, and then maybe that changes his career trajectory. But that's really it.
So a little less mileage on his body, not playing for the national team, but you can't fault the guy for doing that.
And that's where he tore his ACL, playing for the national team. So,
but he could have done it on a playground. He could have done it in practice. So you can't really fault the guy for playing for his national team. All right. So next up is a guy that was taken also 5th overall, this time in the 2016 draft, and that is Chris Dunn out of Providence. So Chris Dunn was drafted by the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I think he is more a victim of circumstance and situation than anything. He's definitely a bust for where he was drafted, but the fact that he's still in the NBA, 6 years later, is an achievement compared to some of these other guys. He was overdrafted based on some pre-draft hype. He also was another guy that kind of had the measurables and could play a number of different positions, but the fact that he got drafted by the Timberwolves during the Tom Thibodeau era there, where he notoriously hates young players, hates young guards, and he didn't get a chance to play much early on, and then was shipped off to Chicago in exchange for Jimmy Butler, and then he had to play for a couple years under Fred Hoiberg, who was completely overmatched as a coach. So I think maybe if this guy, and we can talk about an ideal team, but I think if he is playing in a better situation, a more structured situation, a more nurturing or developmental situation, then I think he does much better. So how could his career have gone different?
I really liked Dunn coming into the draft. I believed all the hype. I was like, oh yeah, man, he's gonna be like the next Gary Payton. He's got that defensive prowess. He's gonna develop that offensive game. He's really just gonna be a franchise cornerstone like Gary Payton was. And so I mean, it was evident his defensive prowess is there. That's the only reason he's still actually in the league, because he's a really good defender. But I think, like you said, right, going to Minnesota and then getting shipped off to Chicago, really not a great place for a young guard to develop and really hone his point guard abilities. He's also a very poor shooter, and it's surprising to me, and we're going to talk a lot about this, how poor so many of these point guards are at shooting the ball. And it's just crazy to me that NBA teams wouldn't just like put a guy like Chris Dunn and be like, all right, man, you're going to be in the gym every day for like 2 hours a day with the shooting coach, and fix your mechanics or fix whatever's going on and learn to properly stroke the ball. So
that's what the Spurs did with Kawhi Leonard. They
exactly
rescued his career.
Yeah, exactly. So it's shocking to me that not more time is given to these guys in terms of developing their shooting skills. And so I think with the proper coaching, like you said, he maybe develops a little bit better. I would say a team maybe like the Nuggets or the Warriors, two teams that are really good at developing players, where he doesn't have to really come in and be the face of the franchise or lead the team. As a young guy, he can kind of develop a little bit more there, and maybe he's better than just a rotational piece, and maybe he's more of a all-star type player. But that's really where I see Chris Dunn, where he could have improved, was really getting that shooting, coaching for his shooting, and and just getting more coaching in terms of developing as a point guard. That's where he really needed to get the focus, and he's not super injury prone. Yeah, he's a couple of injuries, but yeah, I think it's just a developmental thing with him.
Yeah, the shooting is a common theme that we'll see in this draft, where it just doesn't translate at the NBA level. And he's a guy that's a career 29% shooter from three, just under 46% from two. So nothing special there either. I think he had his best season when he was on Chicago, that second year, where he was able to flourish a little bit. But it's just things never really clicked for him, because of the things we talked about with the situation. And then, like you said, if he does go somewhere else, like the Nuggets, if he goes 7th to Denver, where he's playing with Jokic instead of whoever he was playing with in Chicago or Minnesota, then things could have gone differently. But this was a tough draft, man. This was, you look at the top 10, draft. It is, there's, maybe a few years ago, we would have felt differently about Ben Simmons and Brandon Ingram and of course Jaylen Brown. So the top three, you'd be like, all right, great top three, and then it drops off pretty hard after that with Dragan Bender and Chris Dunn. So maybe it makes sense that he was 5th overall in a pretty bad draft, but in general, yeah, it's just I think just more situation than anything for him.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so next up is a player that went 7th overall in the 2015 draft, and that is Emmanuel Mudiay. So he actually played his last year before going to the NBA in China for the Guangdong Southern Tigers. So he took the Brandon Jennings route of wanting to make a little money before he played in the NBA, which looks like a good idea because his NBA career has not been very long. But he was drafted, again, 7th overall by the Denver Nuggets in 2015. So what went wrong with his career?
Yeah, he had all the physical skill sets of an NBA point guard. He was 6'3", 200 pounds, was pretty athletic, but never seemed to put it together in the NBA. He struggled to shoot the ball. His career average from the 3-point line is 30%. His field goal is around 40%. In the modern NBA, if you can't shoot, then you're not really gonna make it, right? In this NBA, the bigs are shooting better than 35% from the 3-point line, and so Moutier is just under the bigs that are shooting 35% as a point guard, and that's going to be totally unacceptable. And he never develops anything whatsoever. He never shows any handles. He never shows any defense. He never shows any shooting abilities. And when you're in the league and taken 7th overall and you don't develop any of these things, it's kind of crazy that he doesn't develop, especially going to an organization like the Nuggets where they're pretty good at developing young players. That just means you just lack the talent and the drive to become one of the best players in the NBA. And I think he had an okay career if he was just looked at as like a 2nd round pick or something, a late 1st rounder. But being a number 7 overall pick, you gotta give more than that.
The pressure definitely did not help, and maybe this pokes some holes in our theory about Chris Dunn being better in Denver. But
yeah, maybe.
So ironically enough, this was the same class as Nikola Jokic. So he was drafted. Of course, Jokic was a 2nd round pick, but this is a draft where the Nuggets could have drafted Devin Booker, who went 6 picks later at 13th overall. So imagine that duo. It's like an upgraded version of Jamal Murray and Jokic. So
that would have been nuts.
He was a really raw prospect, and I think that was his issue. I think he grew up in the Congo, came to the U.S. when he was young, but he still played high school basketball in the U.S. and then, of course, chose to go play in China. So maybe if he goes and plays a year at a good school, maybe he gets to hone up some of these skills. I don't know what the long-term effect could have been, but he had some really big moments early on. He had a couple 30-point games in his career early on in his rookie year. He was on the all-rookie team, so he was obviously good. And then he had some even better moments when he got traded to the Knicks, and I thought really that he would develop into a good player. But I think his issue is that he can't shoot. He needs the ball in his hands to be an effective player, and he's not good enough to be the primary ball handler on a good team. And that was his big issue. So I thought, looking at this era and looking at the other guys that were taken in this draft, I thought maybe if he ends up in a couple other places like maybe Boston or Portland or Houston, where he's able to come off the bench and play behind, somebody like James Harden or Dame Lillard and learn from those guys, and again, not have to deal with the pressure of having to carry a franchise, whether it's Denver or the Knicks. So I thought that could have helped.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. He just needed to go somewhere where he could come off the bench and develop a little more and, focus on his shooting and things like that. That's absolutely what he needed.
Mm-hmm. And it's surprising that he's not in the NBA at this point. I really thought he could have had a longer career, but he just I think he last played with the Kings last year on like a hardship contract. He only played 2 games. So
yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's crazy, but he's out of the league.
Yep. All right. So next up is a guy that was drafted pretty recently, and he went 7th overall, and that is point guard Killian Hayes from France. He was drafted 7th overall again by the Detroit Pistons in the 2020 draft. And, maybe it's too early. It's only been 2 years. But I think we have a good idea of what this guy's ceiling is, and I think he is just a good rotational player. I think the Pistons could read the tea leaves, they could read the signs, and that's why they drafted 2 guys basically that play his positions in the ensuing drafts in Jaden Ivey and Cade Cunningham. So he's been playing a little bit more because Cade Cunningham's been hurt this year, but I think in general he's not a starting NBA player, not on a good team. I'll say that. He's not a star player for sure. And I think, he actually had the misfortune of being drafted by a Detroit team that was kind of actively trying to lose. And that's never a good thing for your development because you pick up bad habits, you you don't get to play perhaps as much as you should because they're trying to tank a little bit. So, they just don't seem to put you on the right path to development when you're trying to lose actively. We've seen it happen with Philadelphia with numerous guys and a couple guys, or a guy we're gonna talk about later in this pod. But how could things have gone differently for Killian Hayes?
Hayes was pretty talented coming in. People are like, oh, he might be the number 2 point guard behind LaMelo Ball, things like that. So the Pistons taking him was probably based on hype, but definitely a bad landing spot for him. They absolutely did nothing to develop him. And basically 2 years after drafting him, he's out of the rotation. They took Cade Cunningham and, Ivy, like you said. But I think it's a bit tricky with guys coming out of Europe. There may be certain expectations that they're used to playing pro ball, overseas, so that they should be more NBA ready. But, Hayes, when he was drafted, was only 19. And he didn't play he played a few years in the EuroLeague in France and things like that. And so maybe the expectation was for him that, oh, you're more NBA ready. And when he came in, he looked pretty raw. I think he could become like a Sean Livingston type player if he just got to a team where he could just be a rotational guy like the Spurs or the Knicks, where he's just looked at, okay, he's a rotational piece. We'll play him, we'll develop him, give him some time to learn the NBA game, things like that. But the Pistons completely were just 2 years in, like, we're not even going to give him a run anymore. Like, that's the craziest part, that they just decided in 2 years he's a bust and we're not going to play him.
He's playing a lot. He's playing a lot this year because Cade Cunningham's been hurt, but I think
right.
It's not going
even
anywhere,
then he's
basically
playing like 15 to 18 minutes a game still, right? With Cade Cunningham being hurt, they rather play Jaden Ivey over him. So that's the problem with Hayes. He's not getting that run to really develop, and I think a team like the Spurs would do a better job of at least giving him some run and developing him a little bit more.
The Spurs are like the default for any like Euro guy. You're just like, just send him to San Antonio, he'll be fine.
Send it in Pop. Pop will take care of him.
Yeah, exactly, right? They'll figure it out. He has no pressure on him. It's not like there's a ton of pressure up in Detroit, but looking at this 2020 draft, I think Bill Simmons points this out all the time, that this was like the COVID draft, right? You couldn't work guys out. You couldn't do face-to-face interviews. Everything went over Zoom. And he points out that maybe teams in the top 5, he talks about Wiseman all the time and how they maybe should have drafted Tyrese Halliburton if they had actually brought him in for a workout. But if you look at it, like, the top 10 is pretty brutal. There's some good players, some rotational guys. You're like, okay, Okongwu, all right, he's decent. Okoro, maybe he's a good piece on a contending, possibly contending Cavs team. But I think there's just a lot of misses, and I think some of the best players in this draft are in the second half of it, the bottom 15. So other than, of course, Anthony Edwards, Halliburton, Tyrese Maxey. I believe Desmond Bane was in this draft. He was the 30th. Yeah, we already did a redraft of this, and I think a lot of the guys that we talked about were in the back half of this draft, or at least the back half of the first round. So I think we gave Wiseman. We still redrafted Wiseman, but I don't know. I don't know if we'd still do.
This was before this season, so if you did that, exactly. If we do the redraft again, Wiseman probably doesn't even make the lottery after this season.
Probably not, man. I don't think he would. So I think maybe Hayes was just a victim of that, where he just teams banked more on the tape of him against these guys, these Euro guys. They didn't get a chance to bring him in for a workout, a real interview, whatever it might be. So, yeah, I think the Spurs are the default. Send the Euro guys there, they'll be fine. But I think in general, it's just, I think we've seen his ceiling, and that's a rotational guy, which is not bad. I think if you're drafting in the top 10, you're probably hoping for an all-star at least, but at least he is a, viable NBA player at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Euro guys, so next up, we have a guy that was drafted 8th overall in 2017, and that is Frank Ntilikina, a.k.a. Frankie Smokes, was drafted by the New York Knicks. So what went wrong with Frank Ntilikina?
First of all, really weird nickname, Frankie Smokes. I don't know why people started calling him Frankie Smokes, but that's what he ended up being called.
Because Ntilikina sounds like nicotine.
I get it. It's just weird. People are just like, we're gonna call him Frankie Smokes now.
It's a New York thing. I really
Yeah.
like it. It's one of my favorite NBA nicknames. It makes no sense. I mean, it makes sense. He definitely doesn't deserve a nickname. He's not good enough.
Exactly. He doesn't deserve a nickname. Yeah, exactly.
But it's cool. Frankie Smokes. I like it. It's a very
Frankie
New York
Smokes.
thing. Like you think of
It
like
is
the
definitely.
Sopranos. You know,
I can see
like
that.
one of Tony Soprano's henchmen would be like, "Oh yeah, that's Frankie Smokes." You know, that's Tony Tuna or whatever. You know.
There you go. There you go. In terms of what went wrong with him, he had the size and the length to become a good point guard in the NBA. He was 6'4", 200 pounds. However, I'm not sure why he was even considered a lottery pick, given if you look at what he did in his 2 years in France playing pro ball, he did nothing. He played, I think, roughly no more than 15 to 18 minutes a game in France, and he was just there for 2 years. And I think sometimes these international players get too overhyped, and this was the case here with him. He never developed a jumper. He never had a sense for playmaking, let alone, basic dribble moves. Like sometimes it was like, this guy can't even dribble a ball. What's he doing in the NBA? I think he was also expected to come out to be like a great defender, but I think he's an average to below average defender. And so that's the only reason he probably didn't flame out of the NBA sooner, because he could play some defense. And then on top of that, it doesn't help that he was picked by Phil Jackson on the Knicks, and at this point in his career, Phil Jackson couldn't develop anybody if he tried, and the Knicks were just awful at that time under Phil Jackson's leadership. So a lot of things went wrong here, overhyped, just not the right coaching staff for him, and again, he just didn't develop as people thought he would.
And in general, this is kind of a brutal point guard draft. If you look at
100%.
it, I mean, the top is Markelle Fultz and Lonzo Ball. So we already talked about Fultz. We might talk about Lonzo a little bit later, but you look at some of the other picks, it's crazy that they could have gotten Donovan Mitchell. And this is the guy that supposedly they were willing to trade everything for, earlier this year. But besides that, not much else going on, Maybe they get Jared Allen, maybe they get OG Anunoby, there's some other guys. But if they were looking for a point guard, it's pretty brutal. Maybe Derek White is another good point guard in this draft. But,
maybe, yeah.
He's nothing special either. He's a decent rotational guy. But it's just, it's just the Knicks, man. The Knicks usually overthink these things. They, instead of going for the guy that kind of profiles similar to Frankie Smokes and Donovan Mitchell, who was supposed to come into this league as like a defensive specialist, right? That was his calling card coming into the NBA. That hasn't been the case. He's been much better than that. But it's just ironic that they wanted the defensive guy and they went with Ntilikina. And I think his primary issue is, like a lot of these guys, he just couldn't shoot. He's a career 33% shooter from three. And like you said, he was supposed to be this elite defensive player, and he's never been that. He's very average defensively. And I know we talked about this a lot, but the Spurs would have been a good pick for him if he went, 29th.
He's coming out of France. The Spurs should take him. That's it.
Exactly. If he went 29th overall to the Spurs, or if he goes somewhere like the Jazz, where again they're better at developing guys and letting guys play. And, playing under the bright lights in Madison Square Garden, again, for Phil Jackson, who did not have the best track record at this time of drafting guys or signing guys. If he goes somewhere without the pressure, maybe he develops, but also he just can't shoot. And that's just going to limit how effective of a player you can be. It's really as simple as that.
Right. And I think Donovan Mitchell wasn't even on the Knicks' radar. I think the debate was Frank Ntilikina, obviously butchered his name there, and then Dennis Smith Jr. I think that was the debate for the Knicks. They were like, do we go with him or we go with Dennis Smith Jr.? And that's really the two guys they were considering. I don't even think Donovan Mitchell was ever brought up as a target for the Knicks in this draft. And that's the crazy part. I don't even think they scouted Donovan Mitchell, if I remember it correctly. They were just too locked in on point guards.
Mm-hmm. They would have been better off taking like Malik Monk. At least he can shoot.
Yeah, at least he can shoot. Exactly.
He's having a little renaissance these days with the Kings.
He is. I'm shocked at how well he's playing with the Kings right now.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Dennis Smith Jr., he is our next name here. So he's a guy that was drafted 9th overall. So just actually the next pick after Frankie Smokes. That's probably why people call him Frankie Smokes, because it's
so hard to say his last name. Yeah, so hard to say it.
So he went ninth overall out of NC State to the Dallas Mavericks. He had a solid rookie season on a bad Mavs team. So that's usually, I don't want to say it's really not an indicator of anything, to be honest, but it's just like, okay, at least this guy can play. That's usually the general takeaway, right? Is even if the team is bad, even if they win, in this case, I think they won 25 games or something. So you're like, okay, at least this guy can play basketball. He averaged, I think it was, he averaged 15, 4, and 5. So you're like, okay, that's not bad. But then he's involved in the Kristaps Porzingis trade. Things go a little sideways with his career. And of course, his big problem, similar again to a lot of guys, is that he just couldn't shoot. He was super athletic. He could jump out the gym, but just couldn't shoot. Not a good three-point shooter, just around 31%. Not a great shooter in general. He's about 44% from two. So aside from his, I think you would call elite athleticism, there's not much else he does well. And I think that's his issue. I think at the very least his ceiling, which we're seeing now, is that just he's a rotational guy. And maybe he's putting up, big numbers on a bad team perhaps, but just not worthy of this selection. So how could things have gone differently for Dennis Smith Jr.?
I think Dennis Smith Jr., again, like you said, right? Not a guy who could shoot the ball particularly well. Just an average or below average point guard, really. And so I really see him as a poor man's Russell Westbrook, right? He can jump out of the gym and he's quick and athletic, but he can't run the offense like Russell Westbrook could, and he can't even shoot the ball like Russell Westbrook could. And that's like a concern in the NBA. Like, Russell Westbrook is not a great shooter by any means, and if you're worse than him, yikes, that's bad. So it's surprising, right, that again he doesn't get a shooting coach from the Mavs, and the Mavs don't do a lot to develop him. But there were also, rumors about him having a pretty shitty attitude, a little bit of a diva type of player, when he didn't really do anything to really earn that kind of level of attitude that he came into the NBA with. So maybe the Mavs are just like, hey, we're probably going to move on from this guy. We probably don't want him sticking around, and we're not going to take the time to develop him. But I do see him maybe being useful to a team like the Bucks, where he could play off ball with Giannis and maybe make more backdoor cuts and things like that, and use his athleticism to rebound and things like that, where he's not put in a situation where he's the point guard, he's running the offense, things like that. He's probably a better player when he's off ball, and he's doing that in Charlotte a bit. I think right now he's on the Hornets, and he's been doing that with like LaMelo and things like that. So he's a decent rotational guy, but again, that's not enough to take there at number 9 overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's putting up the best averages of the last 3 years. He's averaging 9, 3, and almost 6 assists a game. So not bad.
Not bad.
And that makes sense, right? He's not, if he goes to the Bucks or some other team like that, he's not initiating the offense. He's finishing. He's making these cuts. He's playing defense because he has the size to guard, most point guards, most shooting guards, things like that. So it just, I didn't know about his attitude issues, but it makes sense that would kind of hurt his long-term career prospects for sure.
Yeah, I think it was just like, I don't know if it's true or not, but there were just rumors that he was like this diva type player, and he thought he was like this all-class NBA guy. I mean, most of these guys think that, but it was just like he was just like super arrogant, something like that. That was what was said about Dennis Smith Jr.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it probably depends on the source. Like if the Mavericks are trying to tarnish his name after trading him after he played 100 games for them or whatever, then they're like, oh yeah, he had a bad attitude. That's why we traded him.
Yeah, they're like, oh, he was super arrogant. You couldn't get along with our guys.
Yeah. All right. So next up is a guy that went 10th overall in 2014, and that is Elfrid Payton out of Louisiana. So Elfrid Payton was drafted by the Orlando Magic. So what went wrong with his career?
Man, I really liked Elfrid Payton coming into this draft. I thought he was going to be one of the better point guards of this draft, but that never happened. And a lot of that is he didn't develop an offensive game. He just never developed a jump shot. He just never could really get to the basket pretty quick. I mean, he's basically the Tony Allen of point guards when it came to the offensive side of the ball. And then he didn't have quite the defensive pedigree that Tony Allen had. So you can just imagine what kind of player he became. And so, across the board, he was just average. Maybe he should have gone late first, early second round. He's a nice rotational guy, but again, you want something more than that from your top 10 pick. You want him to be, at a minimum, borderline superstar maybe, and someone who could be, a reliable second or third offensive option or a great defender, things like that. And Elfrid Payton was none of those things. And he just never developed into that. And a lot of that has to do with his inability to shoot the ball.
So I actually wanted to talk about this. So you mentioned that, with a top 10 pick, you expect a superstar. So I tried to...
I said borderline.
Borderline is fine. I'm just, I'm trying to put these guys into categories of expectations, right? So listen to me, work with me here, see, let me know what you think. So if you're picking first through fifth, you're like, okay, we expect at the very least an all-NBA guy. Yes. Whether that's first, second, third team.
Agree.
Okay?
Yeah, agree. Yep.
If you're picking 6 to 10, you're thinking, okay, this guy may not be all-NBA. He doesn't have to be one of the best 15 players in the NBA at some point during his career, but he should be an all-star.
Yep.
Maybe
I agree with that. Yeah.
Multiple-time all-star is preferred, of course. And then I'm thinking 11 to 20, so end of the lottery, and then right after the lottery, you're thinking, okay, this guy should at least be a viable starter for us.
Right. Agreed. Yep.
Long term. And then 21 to 30, so still in the first round, you're thinking this guy should at least be a rotation guy. So anywhere from, 10 to 25 minutes a game.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And, maybe closer to like a sixth man type player.
Sure. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a starter at this point, even if he's sixth, seventh, eighth guy off the bench,
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, second round and beyond, you're looking at prospects, developmental guys,
high
sixth
risk,
year
high
senior.
Guys.
Yeah, or kind of like
low risk, high reward, like guys you think that were just kind of overlooked and people didn't pay attention to him, and he's like Gilbert Arenas type players.
Or high risk, high reward. A guy like Gilbert Arenas again, who had I think he had character issues, or guys that maybe have like a drug arrest or something, maybe a nonviolent criminal history, or a guy with like a weird characteristic, or
you're just taking a risk basically.
Yeah, or a guy that you're like, this guy played 7 years in college, and he's, we don't want to pick him in the first round because we don't want to give him a guaranteed contract, but maybe there's something there. Maybe he's mature enough, whatever it is. So does that vibe with you? Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay. I agree with that. That's why I said, like, borderline superstar is like multiple all-stars type of the player for me. He's not the elite guy, but he's there. He's above average starter basically.
Mm-hmm. And I think he's not an above average starter. He's a starter. He's a starter on some decent teams, or at least he's a rotational guy. And I think his main crime was just being overdrafted a bit. So if you're going top 10, he ended up basically being traded for the 12th pick, Dario Saric, and a couple other things. So he was just, I guess if you want to be technical about it, he was the 12th overall pick. But either way, not much going on in this draft after that if you are looking for point guards. And I think in general, he's just another guy that just isn't a reliable shooter, but he is second in this draft class in assists. I was very surprised at that.
Not bad.
Nikola Jokic has about 3,500, and Elfrid Payton has about 2,900 assists. And then it drops off pretty hard after that. Marcus Smart, 25. Spencer Dinwiddie, 2,000. So maybe they draft Spencer Dinwiddie, who went 38th, and they're happier about that. But in general, I just think he was overdrafted. But he's a solid backup point guard.
Yep.
He's not like Dennis Smith where you can't run the offense through him. Like he can kind of, if I envision him having like a Ish Smith type career, where he plays for 20 years for 15 teams. You know what I'm saying?
He's on that path right now, isn't he?
Yeah, basically, man. I mean, he's bounced around quite a bit, and I see a little bit more of that. But he's played on, Orlando, Phoenix, New Orleans, the Knicks, and now he's back on Phoenix. So, yeah, not too many, but he's still only 27. So he plays
he's got
for
10 more
another
years to bounce around.
Exactly, right? So he's not. You're not going anywhere if he's your starter, but he could be a good backup on a good team.
Agree.
And I think maybe Boston at 17, if they pick him, I think they moved on from Rondo during this year. They sent him packing to Dallas because he didn't want to be part of a rebuild, but he could have come in, played behind Marcus Smart and Avery Bradley. Marcus Smart actually went in this draft as well. So, yeah, maybe if he ends up somewhere like that, again, same idea where he doesn't have to start, then things go well. So, yeah.
I can absolutely see that. And I think that was one of the things about Elfrid Payton. People were like, oh, he could be like kind of the next Rondo, right? Rondo didn't really have a three-point shot, but, the NBA was heading towards three-point shooting, and three-point shooting becoming a very important part of that game. And it's crazy to me that teams didn't think about that when drafting certain players.
Yeah, not in this era, not when kind of the three-point revolution was happening. And even Rondo ended up being, he shot like 45% from three in the bubble during that bubble title.
He developed it at some point.
Yep, he sure did. All right. So next up is another guy that went 10th overall. This is all the way back in 2011, and that is Jimmer Fredette out of BYU, who was selected by the Sacramento Kings. So what went wrong with him? Too small, too slow. I really, really loved this kid in college. I thought he was going to be at least like a lights-out shooter in the NBA. I thought that would be the one skill that could translate. But it just never panned out. I think it was bad that it hurt him that he was hurted. I think it hurt him that he was drafted by the Kings, during their, I don't know if this was the bottom for them, but they were just close to the bottom consistently. Mm-hmm. And he was just never athletic enough to play point guard in the NBA. And he wasn't big enough to do anything else in the NBA. So you think about some of the other like one-trick pony type guys, like names that come to mind were like Jason Capono or Steve Novak, guys that could stand in the corner and shoot, but they were 6'8", 6'9", 6'10", so they could do some other things, right? They're a big body, they could rebound. But Jimmer was listed at 6'3", but I don't know if he was even that big.
I think he was closer to like 6 feet, right?
It definitely looks like it, And I think it's hard to be a rotation guy when you're such a liability on defense. Like, you're not good enough of a shooter to justify being that huge liability on defense. So how could things have been fixed for this guy? How could Jimmer's career have gone differently?
Right. Like you said, Jimmer could shoot lights out, but he really needed to develop the rest of his game in the NBA. He didn't get a chance to do that. I think a lot of pressure was put on him to be the point guard of the future for the Kings, and that really is not what his role should have been. He should have been treated more like a shooting guard, someone like a JJ Redick or a Sasha Vujacic, who had decent success in the NBA, and they weren't the most athletic guys. They didn't play the best defense, but they could shoot the ball, and that was the role given to them. So I think Jimmer, if he was kind of treated like that, where not being drafted based on what he did in college, and he was like shooting from like 45 feet and nailing them and things like that, and just being overhyped, he could have probably done better, where he was just treated as more of a shooting guard, and just you come in, you give us 10 to 12 minutes, and really your role is going to be to shoot the ball, and we know you're going to be a defensive liability, but if you can generate enough offense for us, we can live with that. And so I thought maybe if he went somewhere like the Thunder, where he provides them some solid bench shooting behind Russ and KD and things like that, and maybe he doesn't piss KD and Russ off like Reggie Jackson did, who was in this draft. But I think he could have had a decent career. I mean, we're not talking all-star or anything like that. He was clearly overdrafted at 10, but he could have had a decent career, and maybe like a Doug McDermott, who's still around in the NBA and he can shoot the ball decently well, and maybe best case scenario, he's like a JJ Redick type who's a lights-out shooter.
JJ had a very long, very successful career, I think, because he learned to play his role. Exactly. He was a great shooter, but I think he also played really hard on defense, and I think he kind of carved out a lane for himself. And I'm sure it kills Kings fans to this day, but Klay Thompson went 11th.
the next pick.
Literally the next pick, and there's a.
I was so happy when the Kings took Jimmer out because I was worried the Warriors were thinking Jimmer too if Clay was gone. That's what I remember thinking. I was like, oh, I know the Warriors are looking for a shooting guard, and they might be like, oh, maybe we should take Jimmer and we can have Steph and Jimmer together on the same team. And I was like, God, I hope this doesn't happen. I hope someone takes Jimmer before our pick.
I think it was Jerry West that really wanted Clay. So
yes, yeah, you're
lucky.
right. Jerry West was there to guide us right.
Thank God for that. But now, I mean, Jimmer, I think maybe now he could play in the NBA a little bit. Maybe
I think so.
More
he could be a guy. Yeah, he could be a guy that gives you like 10 minutes a game and you get him a couple of shots in throughout the game. But yeah, his defense was horrendous and he didn't really try. So, I mean, but yeah, he could maybe play in today's NBA a little bit more.
I think he's content playing in China, scoring like 60 points a game and doing his thing there. So it's like big fish, small pond. He'd just rather just hang out over there. You can't blame him for that.
And he's getting paid. He's getting paid out there.
Yeah, he's probably making more out there than he would here on like a minimum contract. So Absolutely. Good for him. I think he still comes and plays like summer league. Sometimes he probably just wants to hoop and just do his thing. But So the last name on our list is a guy that was drafted 11th overall, and that is Michael Carter Williams out of Syracuse. So he was drafted in 2013 by the Philadelphia 76ers. So what went wrong with Michael Carter Williams?
This one is very interesting because Michael Carter Williams won Rookie of the Year in 2013, but after that his career took a nosedive. His biggest problem was his inability to shoot, and I think some of that might have come from he had a shoulder surgery after his rookie year, and he just didn't quite look the same after that, and then he got traded to the Bucks in 2015, and he just looked really bad on the Bucks, and then he tore his labrum in his left hip. After that, he just definitely lost all his athleticism, and he just didn't look like the same player. So when you lose your athleticism and then you can't shoot, that's a bad combination in the NBA, if especially 75% of your game was predicated on you being athletic. And that's the problem here with Michael Carter Williams. And honestly, it was a shock to me that we're calling him a bust, but after how well he played his first 2 years in the league, and that's the shocking part, is you just don't know what kind of injuries and what kind of things mess a player up, and that's exactly what happened with Michael Carter Williams. He hurt himself a bit and he lost his athleticism and never developed that shooting stroke, and it didn't help that the Bucks were a pretty bad team at that point in time and just didn't really develop him.
And speaking of bad teams, I mean the Sixers were awful.
Oh yeah. Sixers were awful.
This was peak process times, peak processing days. But the thing is, I don't think it was that surprising. I think they drafted him, and I think they quickly realized that this kid is super limited. He's incredibly athletic, but he could never shoot. And again, I mean, he did have the misfortune of being picked by the Sixers during that time. I think they won 19 games his rookie year, 18 games his second year, which he was traded midway through his second year, and then the following year they won 10 years. That was the first year we actually moved to Philadelphia in 2015, and it was the worst basketball team I had ever seen in my life. I'd seen some bad ones as a longtime Warriors fan, but watching this team every day, because they were on cable, and they're the home team, so you're just automatically watching them on NBC Sports or whatever, and it was so bad. Why did you torture
yourself like that, man?
But you know what? It was kind of fun in a way, right? It was you got to know some of these guys that ended up being competent NBA players, right? Like Robert Covington was on that team, T.J. McConnell, Ish Smith, I think, was on that team as well. So it was kind of fun to watch that them develop, and it helped me like buy low as not a Sixers fan, but a Sixers supporter, because they're
like,
the home team.
Look, I'm supporting you guys. I moved here, and you guys suck, but I'm still supporting you.
So that year, actually, my brother came down, we went to a Sixers-Spurs game, and that was Boban's debut in the NBA. And I think they were down at one point by 50 points to the Spurs. And this was Spurs. They sat, my brother was super upset about this, but they sat Tim Duncan, Manu, and Tony Parker. None of them played.
Of course.
And of course... And they're still blowing out the Sixers by 50 points. And then they bring on this big-ass ogre-looking dude in Boban, and everyone just falls in love. And we started a Boban chant in the crowd, and the whole crowd got into it. I remember a guy two rows down or two seats away from me, and a couple rows down, fell asleep during the game because it was that dull.
It's that dull. It's like I paid $50 to take a nap.
It was definitely not $50 because we were in the second deck and they were awful.
Okay, you were in the
nosebleeds.
All right. You probably paid like $5.
No, man, it wasn't even nosebleeds. It was like 5 rows up from the second deck. So it was pretty good seats, right?
Decent seats, yeah, decent.
You know, those will run you a couple $100 for the Warriors, but I think we paid $8
nowadays.
For them.
Nowadays, back in the day, you could buy $10 nosebleeds for Oracle. I remember doing that.
Oh, of course, I did many times.
I went to the game where they had just made the trade for Baron Davis in his debut, and we bought like $10 nosebleed tickets, and it was an amazing game.
That's just like a different era. That was peak Oracle, just shenanigans. Yep. But anyway, we digress.
Yes.
Back to MCW, and he was just he was really a victim, I think, of the NBA changing so much and basically moving away from point guards that can't shoot. It doesn't matter how, unless you're a Ben Simmons type where you're big enough to post guys up and do things like that and have different aspects to your game, then you can't succeed long term. And I think the Sixers saw that, and I think that's why they let him play so much. And a lot of people say that they inflated his numbers by just letting him play and doing whatever he wants in order to trade him. So I don't know how true that is.
The thing to do is like draft a guy, inflate his numbers, and try to trade him later.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they were hoping for a better pick than 11th.
Yeah.
You know, and they maybe just picked him, saw his limitations, and then moved him. But maybe that's just revisionist history, and the Sixers trying to make themselves look better for making a bad pick. But maybe, if he ends up on a team like Indiana, like closer to the end of the first round, not a huge drop. It's not like he went first overall and then he's going to the end. Like he's going from 11th to like the mid-20s. He could have helped them in those Heedle series, as that backup point guard, backup shooting guard to Lance or George Hill, and help them defensively because he's a big point guard.
He's definitely.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't look like a point guard. He's 6'5". I mean, he's a little skinny, under 200 pounds, but I think he could have done a good job on a team like that, where again he's more of a rotational guy and not the guy that you're expecting to run your offense.
Yep, I see that.
So that is our list of the top point guard busts from 2011 to 2021. So now we will go into our dishonorable mentions list. So we'll do some quick fire, just commentary on some of these guys. Same idea. We'll go in terms of draft position. So two guys actually I added here kind of last minute. So the first is Ben Simmons, who went first overall to the Sixers in 2017. I know he's not quite a bust, but he might be in a few years.
He's definitely heading in that direction. If he keeps up his current trajectory, he's definitely on this list in like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and I mean, it's crazy how quickly his career trajectory changed. He looked like he was on the way to being a perennial All-NBA guy, perennial All-Defense guy. Maybe if he gets his head right, he'll fix his career trajectory. So
maybe.
Next guy is Lonzo Ball. He went second overall to the Lakers in 2018. And I think his big thing is just injuries. And
he can't stay healthy. I mean, he looked pretty decent for the Bulls last year before he got hurt. And you're like, oh, man, this is like kind of the Lonzo you expected with the number 2 pick. And then he gets hurt. And you're like, okay, well, we're going to have to wait another year to see Lonzo come back. And it was initially like it was an injury that was supposed to only keep him out like 2 months. And it's like now it's been like a year and he still hasn't played. So they said like he can't even walk up the stairs, whatever this injury is. Like he's still having trouble climbing stairs. Like that's crazy. So he's going to be out for a while. And that's
he's still young. He's
still young,
25.
But that's a rough injury, whatever he has.
Yeah, I'm starting to get like Brandon Roy vibes from him, where but he's never as good as Brandon Roy, but he's never played a full season in his career, his short career so far. But yeah, he's never played a full season, so it's not looking good for him.
It's not looking good.
All right, next is another guy on the Bulls, Kobe White went 7th overall in 2019. Why is he on your dishonorable mentions list?
He started off hot his rookie year, and then the Bulls, for whatever reason, decided he just wasn't the guy. He's not a great shooter or defender. He also had shoulder surgery recently, and so he's been relegated to the bench, and I don't think he's been getting much run. He's been getting less than like 15 minutes a game with the Bulls right now when he's been healthy. But the guy just fell out of rotation, and I think he's at best a rotational player, and he was taken 7th overall.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next is Brandon Knight, who went 8th overall in 2011 to the Pistons. He had a decent career, bounced around a bit, played, I think, good 5-6 years in the league. Best known for being posterized by DeAndre Jordan in that famous clip where DJ just dunks all over him and makes that hilarious face. So
yeah, and if that's what you're most famous for, then you probably are a bust.
Next is Trey Burke, went 9th overall in 2013 to the Utah Jazz. Why is he on your list?
Just an undersized guy, and he wasn't really strong enough to play in the NBA, but he had a decent career, just not a career of a top 10 pick. He's a rotational guy who could score in bunches here and there, but not a guy who could by any means carry your team.
Yeah, he's most known for being in Allen Iverson lookalike.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. I think he was on the Knicks. He had the braids and the headband, and
I remember
he
that.
looked like mini AI.
I remember.
I also always get him mixed up with Alec Burks for whatever reason.
Yeah. I mean, they have the same last name almost.
Almost, right? Next is Kendall Marshall. Went 13th overall in 2012 to the Suns. Maybe he should have been on our list, but I think going 13th maybe helped him out. Help him just be on the dishonorable mention list, not the actual list. He could have had a good career, but injuries.
Yep.
Injuries piled up. And simple as that.
And I think the Suns traded him after 1 year, so.
Yeah, that's never a good sign. Unless you're getting like a superstar in return, like Minnesota did with Chris Dunn for Jimmy Butler. I think it's just not a good sign for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next is Kira Lewis, went 13th overall in 2020 to the Pelicans. Why is he on your list?
It's still a bit early to maybe put him up there in the top 10. Obviously, he's a late lottery guy, but he's showing flashes, but he's just not getting the minutes, and he's probably just that best case scenario rotational guy. But again, he was taken in the lottery, so definitely have to at least mention him here.
Yeah, and now we're getting outside the lottery here, and that is Wade Baldwin, who went 17th overall in 2016 to the Grizzlies. Just never panned out, never good enough, and that's fine. But he was drafted just outside the lottery, so maybe your expectations change a bit.
Yep.
Okay. Next is Shane Larkin, who went 18th overall in 2013 to the Mavericks. So what's up with him?
Again, just a really bad player, undersized. I mean, he couldn't even stick around as a rotational guy in the NBA. I think he maybe lasted 4 or 5 years at best, and he was just out of the NBA again. I mean, he would have been on this list if he was drafted higher, but again, just have to mention him. Yeah, he's outside the lottery, but definitely when you're drafting that, at least in the first round, you're looking for at least a guy who could be a starter for you there.
Okay, and 18th overall was Tyler Ennis in 2014, who went to the Suns. I think just same idea as Shane Larkin. Also had some injuries that didn't help. And then last and definitely not least, but maybe least, is Jerian Grant, who went 19th overall in 2015 to the Knicks. So what happened with him?
Yeah, he was just an average guy. He wasn't a great point guard. He wasn't really great at anything. He was, just average, and I guess he was taken late enough that we couldn't really say he's a big bust and just a guy we mentioned here on the list. And so yeah, that's where he's at. He's probably the last guy here in terms of point guards where he was just okay. He's a rotational guy, and maybe just on that fringe category of between starter and rotational guy.
Mm-hmm. And before we go, I mean, how do you define a bust? Like, what is your criteria? Is it different for each, like we talked about, 1st through 5, 6 through 10, etc.? Like, how do you define it? Is it a guy that didn't earn a second contract with the same team? Is it a guy that didn't earn a second contract in the NBA based on, again, the timing where he was drafted. Do you have an umbrella definition of what you consider a bust?
I agree with what we were talking about earlier, right? It's about where the guy was drafted and the expectations based on where he was drafted. So, a guy like Ben Simmons drafted 1 overall, and you're expecting him to be kind of this generational type player, and he didn't get there. So, and if he's going to continue down this route that he's on right now, he's a bust, right? Because he's not that generational type guy. Jerry Grant, he goes, pick 19 there. You're expecting him to kind of be a starter. You're expecting him to give you something more, where he can kind of run, be just a good enough player, but he didn't quite get there. So again, he's not on the top 10, but he's somewhat of a bust because he's not really a starter. But again, that's like less of a bust to me than someone like, Markelle Fultz, who was 1 overall. So I agree with you, kind of that definition of where you're drafted and how did you perform versus versus that draft position you were there, right? And so if you're a guy going in the top 5 there, and you're not an all NBA type player, not even making an all NBA team even once, then you might be somewhat of a bust. But if you maybe were like an all-star type guy, so maybe we don't consider you a bust because you did make it, but just not at that tier. You made it in the next tier kind of idea, right? So I would say that's kind of how I would look at it, a bust. It's a guy who was in, like, you're in the first tier and really you perform like 5 tiers below your tier.
Okay.
That's probably a bust, right? Or like 3 tiers below, right? If you're 1 or 2 tiers below, maybe we don't call you a bust, but it's some of it's situational, some of it's like you got to just look at the career and see how the guy did. But yeah, I think
there you go.
Had,
so
you had a good definition of what a bust is.
It's expectation based, and then it's one of those things where you just know it when you see it.
Absolutely.
And I think obviously there's guys that you can have the discussion around, and I think that's where you get into some of the gray areas. So that's why we have guys that are honorable mention, or guys like Lonzo, or it's just injuries or whatever it might be. So I think if we redo this list in a couple of years and he's not doing anything, or he's out of the league, then he's definitely in that category as
exactly.
The same as Markelle Fultz and those guys.
Exactly.
But yeah. All right. Well, that's it for our show today. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you guys checking us out. Make sure to follow us on all the major social media platforms. So you can find us at Facebook at the 4040 Vision Podcast. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at 4040 Vision Pod. And, of course, you can find us anywhere podcasts are found. So Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe so you get notifications every time we drop an episode. We plan to drop an episode every week, so every Monday morning from here until forever. So make sure you keep checking this out. Thank you for rocking with us. Thank you, Sulman. Appreciate your time today, man.
Later, man.
Thanks, everybody. Peace out.